Alright, back with another video from Lizard Landscapes. We've got a Book Nook waterfall. So I know I'm late to the Book Nook scene, but better late than never. So what I tried to do was have the waterfall actually break the plane or break the space or boundaries of the Book Nook and have it actually come out of that enclosed space. So the other thing I tried to do was, instead of using a mirror to suggest that it winds back and then to the left, I actually constructed it to do just that. So it goes back like any normal Book Nook, but it does turn literally to the left and suggest some extra space back there. So that's actually where I've got the LEDs set up, is at a point where you can't see them. So with some LED strips, you've got different kinds of lights. I've got that purple lights if you want to use that. So let's go ahead and get started in creating this Book Nook waterfall. All right, so usually I start off with a sketch. So you can see it going back there and then that plan to have it literally go to the left. You want to make sure that you've got one of these professional dust masks. And you want to make sure that you are near an open window, because I'm going to be using some hot wires from the hot wire foam factory. So I'm just drawing out the simple plan for that river or creek with a magic marker. So I'm using XPS foam. I've got one of the hot wires from the hot wire foam factory, and I'm going to go ahead and I've shaped it into that shape to kind of carve out a simple shallow riverbed. So it does kind of go through XPS foam slowly. It's a little bit difficult. It's much faster with that white EPS foam. But I do prefer this sort of purple pink stuff as far as carving. So I kind of thought that I made it a little too deep. So to fix the shape and to minimize the amount of resin I was going to have to pour, I put in quite a bit of glue to take up that space. So starting to create those rocks, those boulders that kind of line the two sides. Still using that XPS foam and getting rid of the sharp corners with like a razor blade, but decided to try to make these rocks a lot more simplistic. So with videos I've done in the past, they've had, you know, an enormous amount of cracks in the rocks, can look a little too detailed. And in looking at reference photos of boulders, rocks, I noticed that sometimes there's really not a lot of detail. But here, using a wire brush to create more realistic texture to the boulder, but taking a razor blade and cutting a thin strip off of the top can really give a nice realistic ridge to it. So really, in looking at this, I've got that ridge that I created and using a razor blade to cut off the very top thin part of the rock, and then with my fingernail just gouging in that second prominent crack. And so that's really how I did most of the rocks. So cutting out a couple of slices of this same foam. And this is really just so that I could get away from the landscape looking too flat. So it's got this little bit of an elevated section on the very edges of the landscape. So applying some glue and then gluing these little pieces down. And making sure that they dry flush with that piece that they're going on top of with some pins. And so really to stop up the riverbed so that you can pour resin into it, I don't know why I did not use tape, but that is usually what I do. But I'm trying to stop it up here with a piece of that same type of foam, so that when pouring the resin, it gets to a point where it stops and doesn't go all over the table. So using some glue to have it kind of blend backwards nicely. So sometimes it's a good idea to put this into wherever it's going to live, in this case a bookcase. Make sure that it's looking right. Maybe it'll give you some ideas. And so I've created that back extension, how it goes back and then it literally turns left. I'm going to glue that into place. And because this section is totally out of view, it doesn't really matter how this looks. So I'm just going to stop it up with a thin piece of styrofoam. This is just to stop the resin, kind of dam up that area. So pouring in some water is a very early stage of testing to see how this is going to look, like how much resin am I going to need? Is there a leak? Does the water spill out into an area, meaning is it not contained within that area where the the river is supposed to be? So using some of the same glue it took to glue all this together, you can also use this as a way of kind of sculpting, in this case, adding more to the landscape to kind of build it up. And there will be a materials list in the description below. So after that has all dried, I'm just using kind of a base brown to cover this, as in it is the soil before I add all the grass, and applying some watered down glue to where the river is, and then sprinkling onto that glue before it dries some very small gravel. So you can buy ground cover and small gravel at like a model railroad store, or this might just be at the base of your own driveway. And then gluing on some more, small but medium-sized rocks. And of course, with this type of thing, as I did with the boulders, creating some rocks with the foam that are small. So adding some watered down glue to continue to put some of that small gravel in place. And then once that is dried, there will still be some gravel that is not quite glued down. So I'm just trying to glue all of that down before I start the painting stage. So with the riverbed or the creek, just painting it a kind of medium dark green. And trying to, I'm using acrylic, so this dries super fast, so I'm trying to move really quickly in applying all of these different shades, kind of a clay color, and going back in with like more of a slightly lighter green, but trying to have these colors blend into each other. So having more of like a beige towards where the land would be, as I'm doing right there. And then once I get those colors kind of quickly applied, taking a clean, wet brush. So it's totally clean, very wet brush, and trying to blend these acrylic colors together before they dry. And going back in with like the center of the river or creek should be the darkest part. It should be suggesting the deepest part of the river or creek. So this is a process with each project I do where I'm doing this. It's always kind of a struggle. One, because the paint is drying quick. I'm never quite satisfied, but you can always go back in with another coat. And if there's something you don't like, repeat the process. with having a darker color down the middle to suggest the depth, blending it as I'm doing here with a clean wet brush to try to get that more natural blend between the colors and tones. So once that is dried, I've got sort of a light gray that I'm dry brushing onto the riverbed. And this is really to kind of get all those rocks, all those little pebbles to pop. And then applying a sealant over the entire river. So I've let that sealant dry for about 72 hours. And I'm just, again, using water to do a water test to make sure there are no leaks. Plus to make sure that the water is staying where it should stay, because it's representing the resin. The resin is going to do exactly what the water is doing in the water test. So if you've got water that is like going in a different direction, which I did have, pouring a little bit more water into it now, it'll let you know you need to build up this part of the landscape in order to keep that resin contained. So again, I don't know why I didn't use a piece of tape. That would have been a lot easier, but decided to continue to build up that front part because I knew I was going to have to pour a deeper batch of resin into here. And then notice that the water was beginning to escape out of that kind of bend towards the top right. So adding a good layer of glue and then sprinkling some gravel there to aid in stopping or damming up that area. Doing yet another water test just to make sure there's no leaks, that it's flowing exactly the way I want it. And then once I'm sure, I start painting all of that dried glue. So all of that glue is white. So just going back in and painting that to camouflage it. And redoing some of the areas, like dry brushing some of those rocks to make them pop out. Adding another layer of sealant, and I will let that sit for 72 hours before I pour the resin. So while that's drying, going to start to paint the rocks. So all these little boulders started off with kind of a base brown gray. So I've got all of those covered in this kind of batch of base brown gray, and then dry brushing on a whole bunch of different earthy colors. So I've got a brown and going over it with like a lighter brown, and then allowing the texture to kind of pull off some of the paint using kind of a lighter gray at this point. And then if you think you've applied too much of a light gray, as I've kind of done here, you can always go back in and cover it up with a darker color. So here with this rock, dry brushing on some green, and hopefully it makes it look like it's got a lot of moss growing on it. So here's a mock-up. It's always good to do this to see how it's looking. The borders with Foamcore. So I'm beginning to paint the Foamcore. So the issue with using Foamcore is it will warp, because all of this paint is water-based. It'll eventually warp pretty badly, so I'll show you what I did to counteract that. But I'm using a really dark green, forest green, and we'll end up painting some trees onto that later. So really in this process of painting trees, it's super simple, almost cartoonish, and just wanting to suggest that there's a forest there, you know, that it's not just this dark panel to be on the right and left of this stream or river. So got all these little trees painted in there, and then sometimes using a different color. Got some green, and putting some bushes here at the bottom. Also dry brushing on some lighter color so that it doesn't look so flat. So dry brushing on a little bit of light color or dark can really give it some depth, because there's like a varying degree of tones within those trees. painting, making sure all this white is covered up. Dry brushing on some dark color. So now is the resin pouring time. I'm going to pour in 1 part one bottle to 2 parts the other bottle. Again, I'll have all of the materials listed below. So I'm going to combine these two, and I'm going to go ahead and mix this together for about 15 minutes. So once that is mixed, I'm going to go ahead and slowly pour this. Of course, having your project on a level ground, and of course, I am near an open window, in this case near an open balcony, to protect you from the fumes. So there is how it is looking. I'm going to let that dry for about a week before doing the next step. So using a high gloss glue that'll dry clear, I'm going to start to put in all of these ripples. So some people use an airbrush after applying the glue, but you can really do a pretty good job with just a small brush, like going back and forth and kind of twisting the brush around to create these ripples. I'm going to let that dry. And I mean, it looks okay, but every time I do this, I do a second coat because it doesn't quite look the way it should. So usually a second coat will fix that kind of choppy look. So that has dried, and I'm going to start painting the tops of the rocks that are protruding out of the water vertically. So the tops of these rocks that are out of the water would be a different color as opposed to underneath the water. So it's kind of a tedious thing to do here, but yeah, painting the tops of the rocks. So going through this, once that first coat is applied, kind of dry brushing over top of these rocks, some lighter color and darker colors. And be sure and watch this intermission. All right, time for another intermission. This is where I go completely off topic and try to motivate those who haven't found God yet to start searching. The topic for today is really about the whole point to the Bible, in that it's all about God, and God is love. The whole explanation of the Bible and why we are here is love. That's what it's about. Some might say, why then do all of these awful things happen? It's because to have actual, real, genuine love, you have to freely choose it. Because there's a choice involved, someone has the freedom to make the wrong choice. And the result is all of these awful things in the world. If God had made a world where you don't have a genuine choice, the result would be you would never have genuine love. If God is love, he would not create a world with counterfeit love to prevent people from making the wrong choices. God loves you so much, he was willing to take on the punishment you and I deserve, which brings me to Jesus. Scripture says, John 15:13, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." That's Jesus. There are some things even God can't do. He can't make a round square or create a rock too heavy for him to lift, or apparently create a world without choice and still maintain genuine love. An aspect of genuine love is freedom. I think if everyone was asked about freedom, they would respond with saying that they value it and, of course, want it and recognize it as good and something to be desired. No one is going to say, I don't want to be free. That's just not for me. And yet, I feel like some of us would say, I don't want God to give us this extreme freedom that could potentially lead us to rejecting him and making wrong choices. Everyone would be a proponent of freedom. Throughout history, people have fought and died for freedom. So it seems strange to say, why couldn't God have created a world where we are forced to choose love and doing the right thing? In doing so, it would have taken away your freedom, which everyone would admit is a highly valued thing in our world. Whenever someone witnesses to you, you are experiencing someone loving you. Just know that that is what's happening to you when someone witnesses to you. It might not feel like that at the time, but when someone witnesses to you, they are risking you getting angry at them. They're risking an uncomfortable, awkward situation filled with stress, all because they care about you. The opposite of that is people telling you what you want to hear, which is what happens the vast majority of the time you interact with others. Years ago, I reconnected with a friend I hadn't seen since high school. And I remember in the course of the conversation, he said that he basically told people what they wanted to hear. What he meant by that is that he did that so that other people would like him, gain his trust, etc. In saying that, he knowingly or unknowingly admitted that he didn't have their best interests in mind. Value the people in your life who are willing to tell you what you don't want to hear, because they are incredibly rare. In all of my years, including after I became a Christian, only a few times has someone witnessed to me about Jesus Christ. And there was really only one prominent time that it happened. Only a few times. Even if you don't agree with it, at least perceive it as someone caring about you and immediately recognize it as incredibly rare. Allow this to soften your heart and respond with love back to them. The point of these videos is really to motivate you to do your own research and ultimately realize that this topic is worthy of your time. Check out all of the amazing testimonies online of people who have been to heaven and hell and whose lives have been transformed from following Jesus Christ. Thanks for listening. All right, back with this project. I'm dry brushing the ripples with white paint onto the riverbed. So this is something you really got to be careful with because you can overdo it pretty quickly. But before it dries, sometimes what I'll do is just take my finger and remove a good 75% of it, and it'll look a lot better. So taking a pen with some white acrylic paint and trying to paint in some ripples, like there's white water, some foam lapping up against those rocks. So a pen, or using a pen, works for me because it's very sturdy. It's difficult to get that small of a mark with a brush and to get that much control with a small brush. So adding some white foamy areas to the rest of this river. So here is one of the panels, one of the sides. You can see just how warped it is. And so one fix is just painting the back of it. So some of these pieces I needed to paint the back of because they were going to be visible. Other pieces would be, facing the other way, and you wouldn't have to worry about it. And then applying some weights before it completely dries, and then it'll dry in that shape that it's in as the weights are on it. So here's one of the pieces, the very back piece, largest piece, where I didn't have to paint that because it was going to be out of sight. And I'm just spraying it with a water bottle. And in reality, the best method to do this in order to counteract the warp is to saturate both sides with a water bottle. Make sure both sides are completely saturated, then put them under weights for about a week. And they'll be fairly straight, or at least as straight as they're going to get when you wait about a week and then remove the weights. So got a bit of a mock-up set up here just to see how it is looking. And I've got this piece that this is going to hold the waterfall in place. It's going to keep its shape. So it's kind of curved downward. And this is the material I'm going to use for the waterfall, just a plastic you can get at an office supply store. It doesn't have to be frosted like this is. So this will go over that small piece. That piece will keep the waterfall's shape, and then gravity will just kind of take over. So painting that little piece kind of just a stone color. And with a magic marker kind of outlining the ending of that water, even though that wouldn't exist in nature because it would hit the lake or, you know, whatever it's pouring out into. So using a certain product, again, I will have a list of everything I've used in the description below. And this is really to just add texture to this piece of plastic. So wiggling through it with a couple of tools, trying to make it look like falling water. So that's how it's looking, but with every waterfall I do, I usually have two different coats of this material. So applying another coat, kind of wiggling through it with a tool. And even before it's dried, putting it up there just to see how it is looking. Like, is it falling? Is it hanging there realistically? Like, how does it actually look? So then gluing this little piece that holds that shape of the waterfall in place. So while that is drying, I'm going to take some of that same high gloss glue it took to create the ripples, and I'm going to apply a really thin layer over all of the areas where I've painted white acrylic paint, because the white acrylic paint will leave behind kind of a dull look and won't look wet. So in applying this high gloss glue, it'll kind of reestablish that wet look that the water should have. And then I noticed that the very edges of the waterfall just looked too perfect. It was this completely straight cutout. It didn't look realistic. So using some of that same stuff to kind of create some texture on the very edges of the waterfall. So time to apply some ground cover. Just using some very watered down glue and sprinkling what I believe is some pine needles. So just put that into a coffee grinder, some pine needles, and created this kind of brown soil base before I apply like varying shades of green and yellow. So adding some more watered down glue, and then applying or starting to apply some green ground cover. So I'm not going to go over how I created the ground cover. There's an enormous amount of videos on YouTube detailing how you do that. Of course, you could just buy some of it at a model railroad store or online, but it's fairly easy to make. So gluing in or gluing on those boulders, and I put the 2 or 3 boulders that turned out the best up front. And then, you know, as I go back, as it becomes less visible, there, you know, certain boulders that I was struggling with the sculpting stage. So adding more ground cover. So the more you can add with the, you know, varying shades, the more realistic it is going to look. As long as it's earthy colors. So putting in some pine needles here, maybe this is suggesting like fallen branch or twig that you would find on the forest floor. And I noticed with pine needles, if you don't grind them to a fine powder, you can get kind of this chunky look, which kind of looks like dead leaves. So the alternative is to really grind them up into a fine powder, and then you get more of like a soil ground cover look. So applying some, gluing in some small rocks at this point. And I've got another type of ground cover, but it's really more like a vine. But this is a product that I bought. Again, will be in the description below. So suggesting vines, but you see how it sticks together. I can really cover a lot of ground with this instead of sprinkling on a whole bunch of ground cover, but ultimately gives just a different look than ground cover can give. So I've got the texture on the very sides of the waterfall piece, and I'm going to start to paint it in this kind of dark gray blue color. This is really just to add shadow to the waterfall. So if you look at pictures of waterfalls, you would think it's just a whole bunch of white foam, and in reality, there's a lot of shadows going on. Sometimes it'll be broken up, for a bit, and then, the white foam starts over again after this kind of shadow area. So I've covered that, and then going over it with a fairly wet brush and just allowing all that texture that I applied with that product to pull off some of the paint. And of course, that underpainting layer of the shadow kind of shines through. And then going back in, so you could go back and forth with this if you think there's too much white, like I need to add more shadow color, going back in with that dark blue-gray color. And once you think you've got it looking the way you want it, applying that same high gloss glue, because all of that acrylic paint is going to make it look super dull and dry. So this is really just to reestablish the wet look of the water. And then gluing on those side panels. So I've got a water ball or anything with a little bit of weight would work just to keep it in place. And a good idea with this project, at least, to have two of the panels glued up against each other. So using a level, couldn't quite get it perfect, but a level will help you to get it at least close to where it should be. But again, to glue two pieces together at once so that it's not dry on that first back panel, the largest piece, so I can move it around to kind of adjust it to make sure that it lines up with that second piece I just put in. And then continuing to put some fine detail into the waterfall with that sort of negative color. And then with a pen and some white acrylic paint, applying a whole bunch of dots. Really helps make it look like falling water and mist. So gluing the other two panels together. So again, I will try to move quickly in having both of these before the glue dries so that they can kind of assist each other. And so sometimes you have to have one of them leaning a little bit off, so it's not quite level, just so that they can glue up against each other properly. So this is how this is looking. See how the corners are square, they're lined up with each other. So I've got a giant leftover piece of Foamcore. I'm always trying to be your poor man's guide. Instead of buying some new stuff, just whatever you can find around the house. This happened to work. Had a giant wrinkle in the top of it, but I'm going to use it anyway. And tracing on the underside of it, just so I can get the exact shape that the top needs to be. So kind of redefining what I had traced and then taking an X-Acto knife and cutting that out. So I'm going to paint the top of this. Didn't do too good of a job, but it really just needs to, not be white, because that would just stand out. And did the same thing to flatten that out with weights. So trying to figure out, so I've got probably my cell phone in the far back left, and just seeing how the trees interact with the light. Do I need to move the trees? Where's the optimum spot to start gluing these trees down? So once you figure that out, I've got this tool, kind of like an ice pick, where I can bore a hole into the landscape and then apply a little bit of glue to that and start gluing in all of these trees. These are just seafoam trees that I ordered online. So time to finally glue the waterfall piece into place. So what I'm going to do is just hold this in place with some pins and then remove those later. But this will really help make sure that it dries in the shape that you want it to be. So applying some glue there. So once that has dried, I'm going to remove these pins. I'm going to add another layer of glue to kind of try to blend the two pieces together. And once that glue has dried, I'm going to take some white acrylic paint and try to really, as far as the color and the look, try to blend these together and having that white foam kind of go back into the river. Then applying some glue on the sides. So I've got that same material that is more of like a vine type material, that just to cover up, camouflage those sides of that piece that is, making sure that the waterfall holds its shape. I'm going to cover up again with some white, with some high gloss glue to cover up that white acrylic paint, reestablish the shine. So all of these pieces look like they don't make sense, because they really don't, but it's a whole bunch of pieces to elevate that LED strip. So I'm going to glue these together, and they're shaped in such a way that no matter how you look into the book nook, you cannot see these pieces. So they're kind of hidden back there. So it doesn't matter if you paint them. See, if I go all the way over to the right there, you cannot see these. They're just meant to elevate the LED strip. So this is totally optional. You could have the LED strip on the forest floor, creating that light, but I wanted them elevated a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and glue those in place. And I'm going to apply some glue to the tops of these barriers to the book nook and glue in that top piece. So even with that process of trying to de-warp that foam core, it's just a little bit warped. But nothing, a couple of books and some glue can't fix. So here it is in that bookcase. So usually bookcases allow you to push one of the shelves forward so you can fish something, in this case an LED strip, through the bottom. And I've got some tin foil on the back piece. So this is totally hidden. Again, doesn't matter if it's painted. But the tin foil reflecting, helping to reflect that light. I'm going to just add some tape. Again, this is not visible. Books will be covering this. But just so that I can lift that back flap up and be able to still get in there if for whatever reason I need to get back in there to get to the LED strip, as opposed to permanently sealing that LED strip in there. Now I'll be able to get back into it. So that's how that will flip up. LED strip will go right there. So putting that into place. And there you have it, Book Nook Waterfall. The waterfall breaking the barriers of the book nook, flowing outward, and with the book nook actually going back and to the left, literally. Usually people use a mirror to do that, to just suggest that it's going back to the left. But anyway, Be sure and watch or check out the rest of the videos on this channel. And as always, thank you for watching.